G'day YouTube, it's the 23rd November 2023, it's my wife's birthday and she's a massive Tomb Raider fan, so I put together something special for her. This is going to be a really long video, so grab yourself a drink and a snack and we'll get into it. We start off by downloading some models to use for the chest pieces. All of these are linked below. For the pawns I'm using these Jaguars. For the rooks I'm using some Mayan temples. The knights are Velociraptors. The bishops, I'm going to use these Anubis druids as a stand-in for Cleopatra's guards. I know they're not exactly as they look in the game, but in my mind that's sort of how I remember them. The king of course has to be the T-Rex. He's a fantastic boss in every game, and the queen is Miss Lara Croft herself. To tie all these pieces together I'm going to use some common bases. As the T-Rex is so long he'll need a stand to make sure he clears all the other figures. So with the models downloaded, we're moving into Prusa Slicer to get everything scaled up. As our chessboard uses 40mm squares, I'm going to scale all these figures to 40mm along the x-axis, and checking the y-axis is 40mm or less. Here for the Mayan temple I need to unlock the scales and make it a bit more suitable and trim it up a little bit. As I'm going to be using common base for everything, I need to take the base off this raptor. I'll need to do the same thing for the Lara figure when she comes in. I actually ended up redoing this later and mirroring the raptors so they sort of face each other. Here's the big boy, our T-Rex, scaling him to suit. And finally Miss Croft herself. Scaling it at 40mm way too big, so I end up adjusting her Z height to be about the same as the Anubis druid that I'll be using as the bishop. For the bases I had to resize and flatten them out a little bit. I didn't want them quite so lumpy. I wanted something a little more flat so it'd be easier to stick the figures to. T-Rex I'm going to use a modification of that crystal cluster. With everything sized and saved, it's off to Chitubox to get them ready for resin printing. The best thing about resin printers is it's the height that determines the print time. So they're these little Jaguars print at the same speed of 1 hour and 10 minutes. It doesn't matter if I do one figure or if I fill the whole build plate. So I'm going to stack this build plate as best as I can. I'm manually going to support all of these figures. I'm using the insane support settings from 3D Printing Pro. His video is linked below. Check it out if you get some time. It's exactly the same technique as he's using. We're using really heavy supports underneath the figure. We're trying to keep them in areas where they're not going to be visible, so they won't leave any damage. I mean, even if they did leave damage, you won't see it because it'll all be hidden. Checking for islands, it's really important you get all of them, otherwise you'll have stuff floating in your resin vat that can crack it later. Here, where I'm not using heavy supports, I'm using mediums and lights. These light supports are fantastic, they're so fine and thin, but you need to use a few of them sometimes. See here I'm using ultralight supports on the nails of the raptor and also on the knuckles. Using the island checking function built in Chitubox to make sure I get absolutely everything. This druid took me over an hour to get right. There's nothing hard about this process. It just can take a crazy long time if you've got super complicated shapes like this and you don't have the best eye for where the islands are. While we watch me fumble around with this figure, I'll talk a little bit about the resin printer that we're going to be seeing in a second. My printer is actually an Anycubic Photon upgraded. I think it's known as a Foxtron all over the internet. It's been modified with a Chitubox V2 and a mono screen, so Chitubox treats it just like an Elegoo Mars Pro. It gives me much faster print times. In its stock build, to print something like this would have taken maybe 15 hours. It's going to print in less than 5. It's also got a newer build plate and a magnetic build surface just to make my life a bit easier. You'll see it in a second when we start actually printing these figures. Out of the way, we move on to the T-Rex. This was way easier to support. Plenty of light supports used on that tail. Lots of light supports all working together can do a lot to hold your model in place. Moving on, it's really important to get each and every one of these teeth. If I don't support it, it's going to fail. I'll have resin floating around in my vat. It could even crack my build plate on the next print if I don't clean it all out. See here, I missed one. Lara's also another humanoid figure, and these are the ones I really struggle with. humans are just more complicated than animals. I'm a little nervous about these supports up by her face. I'm worried they're going to bind and actually ruin the print. See, missed a couple of little spots on her foot. And again on her face. Now I could have tried to print these bases flat, but some of the print quality is not fantastic, so it's always better to tilt them a little bit like this. Because you're not going to see the bottom of them, I can heavy support the crap out of it. Same goes for the stand here for the T-Rex. Just trying to pick out all the corners. Then going back and absolutely peppering the underside. I really wanted to do something custom. This is a one-of-a-kind build, so I decided to make my own resin. Thomas Sandala did a great video about adding pigments to resin. He recommended a 1% ratio, so I'm using 2 teaspoons, which is 10 grams, of this Pearl X metallic pearl pigment in 1 litre of this green water washable resin by NovaPro. Unfortunately the resin was too viscous for my magnetic stirrer, so I had to manually stir it, but it does look great. The pigment didn't seem to affect the printing, everything printed out. Here we go with our first Resin Lapse print. To do this time lapse I'm using the Resin Lapse cable by Uncle Jesse. I'll link his video down the bottom. Here come our bishops. You can see how much thinner the ultra light supports are compared to the heavy supports. After a clean up, it's even clearer. These ultralights, they break off when you just breathe on them. Unfortunately the heavies need to be taken off with the sericide cutters. This druid turned out absolutely great, but my FET was a bit old and the other druid had a defect. You can see here where one of the supports let go from the base and it completely ruined his chest. He reprinted just fine though. Here are the bases that we supported. I really want these bases to be like dead flat, so I've hit it with some 400 grit wet dry. This was also done to the feet of all the models, so they had a flat surface to stick to. It goes without saying that once the wet sanding was done, I gave them another wash. If you're going to get into resin printing, a wash and curing station is a fantastic investment. This one here from Anycubic was about, I think, $200 back in the day. I even picked up an extra wash bucket for me. The best about water washable resin is water is cheap, so you can change it more often. Just make sure you dry it in the sun and don't pour it down the sink. Like, let the sun cure the uncured resin in the water. Before you cure though, it's really important that you dry. If you've got water, you're going to have uncured resin in that water, and that'll show as like a chalky sort of whitish hue on your prints, which can make them look a lot less appealing. Just using a hairdryer here with a cool setting on it. You don't have a wash and cure station, you can leave them out in the sun for 5 minutes or so, maybe rotate them every 2 minutes, and the sun will do a great job of curing, especially if you live in Australia. See here a quick rotation before giving them another cure. So with all the other models out of the way, I went on to the real business. Here we are doing Lara. So I've opened up the printer to get a better photo, and the Resin Lapse system from Uncle Jesse is absolutely fantastic. This is shot on a Canon 700D using the stock kit lens. You can see here the support I was worried about near a face really wasn't a problem. And here comes our big daddy, Mr. T-Rex. All the models dried, washed, cured, sanded, so they're nice and flat. It was time for assembly. For assembly, I'm just using resin. You can see I'm going straight out of the vat. I'm actually using a really old sable brush. The resin ruined this brush, so maybe use a synthetic if you're going to do this. I'm just using a UV torch to cure the resin. It sticks great, and the refractive index is exactly the same. I wasn't happy with the colour, so I used some Tamiya X25 clear green to brighten it up. You can see the difference here between the painted and the unpainted. And yes, that's a paintbrush in my mouth. I'm a grub. green pieces done, it was onto the brown. I couldn't find a brown transparent resin, so I had to make my own. I tinted up some clear with some Liquitex acrylic ink. I've used transparent burnt umber and transparent raw sienna, and then I added in the 2 teaspoons of the Pearl X antique bronze. Here I learned my lesson. I've used a bottle instead of the beaker. The stirrer looked like it was doing okay, but it just didn't have enough force to pull the inks in. You can see it here that it only really gets to halfway. So I gave up, put the lid on and gave it a good shake. This time I also filtered the resin. I just didn't want that bean going into the bottle. Important note, between the green and the brown prints I changed my FEP. All these models printed with absolutely no issues whatsoever, so it was just laziness on my part that caused that Druid to fail.
Try to reach you, but you close your mind. So much to say, the words are hard to find. You're running out of stamina. I see it in your eyes. Let me be your light. We can reignite like fireflies.
Yeah, here first good look at the colour of this resin, and it came out great.
Whatever emptiness inside, I feel it up, make it feel alright. Cause I'm never giving up on you. Cause I'm never giving up on you.
Assembly for these was exactly the same as a green set, using the resin and the UV torch to stick them down. I don't have a clear brown from Tamiya, so I actually gave all the animal figures and the temples an extra coat of the resin, and it really made the colour come up and it really made them glow beautifully. The issue was it softens some of the finer details. You'll see it in a sec once I get this next lot cured. There, great colour, great glow, but a little bit soft. So I didn't apply this to the humanoids. For the humanoids I just gave them a coat of the transparent raw sienna and they seem to blend in just fine. Next up, all the pieces got a coat of clear acrylic. This is a really nice gloss from Super Cheap Auto. I used the whole can on all the pieces, that's all 32, but the gloss and the shine was absolutely insane. Trying so hard while doing this not to get paint, like acrylic, on my camera. So to finish these up, I wanted some felt on the bottom. One $10 piece of adhesive felt from Spotlight cut into 40mm squares was plenty to do all 32 pieces. So my intention here was to use a sharp Stanley knife or my hobby knife to trim really easily around the round pieces. This turned out to be a major ball ache, so I completely abandoned this and grabbed a set of sharp scissors from the kitchen, and that did a much better job. So moving forward, that's how I did all the felt work. With the chest piece just about done, I had to jump back in the Thingiverse and start the work on the board. I wanted to find some nice ruins, and I like the look of these. I also need something that would hold the board up, like pillars. I printed up 8 pieces for the corners, a texture palette for SlapChop painting because I've never done it before, and a spare piece to work. All up, these pieces took 90 hours to print at a 0.2mm layer height. The printing done, I cut down to $10 MDF board from Bunnings, I think it's 6mm thick to suit, and just super glued the prints down, checking everything fit as I went. The cheapest super glue is the best. The packs I just put up were $1.75 for 6. Sorry about the terrible top-down footage, I didn't have my ISO set right. Both cameras are identical. They're Canon 100Ds, I just forgot to bump up the ISO because I'm a moron. It gets better as you go on. With the 3D printed parts stuck down, I grabbed some pebbles from the garden and just super glued them in place as boulders. blend the base in, I use some acrylic gap filler from Bunnings. This stuff's dirt cheap, it's like $3 for a tube. One tube was plenty. This board's 40 centimeters by 40 centimeters, so it really does go a really long way. The trick was to try not to get it too thick because it did slow down the drying. I did have some bits that were still wet when we move on to the next part. Just covering all the rocks to try and give it a nice natural look. Now I'm cleaning up with a wet paper towel, just smoothing it all over. Even after the wet smoothing, some bits were a little bit too finger markery, so I gritted them up with some sand. You can see by the clock in the main screen, I gave it a good 5 hours to skin over, but I probably should have given it a bit longer because it was thick in bits. At least I managed to fix up the ISO on the top camera so you can see what I'm doing. So next up was the first step in the SlapChop method, which is the base coat of black. I use Citadel Chaos Black by Games Workshop, but don't do this, it's like $33 a can. The $10 White Night Paint Primer from Bunnings would do exactly the same job. Next up, it's to overbrush with the grey. I'm using an artist acrylic and lightening it up with a little bit of white. I'm using this because I have it on hand. It's also stupid. For $2.28, grab yourself a tube of cement grey from Bunnings and just use that. It just has to be cheap paint because you're going to cover it over it anyway with contrast paint and dry brushing. You can see me wiping the excess off onto the texture palette that I printed up. The reason we use the texture brush palette instead of using a paper towel like you normally would is we don't want to dry out the brush. You want to keep it wet enough that the paint goes on fairly evenly. The dry brushing really does make the details come out, or sorry, the overbrushing makes them come out really nicely. Last step in the prep for the SlapChop technique is a dry brush. Here I'm using Wraithbone instead of white. The reason I'm using Wraithbone is it's a little bit more ivory, it's going to warm up the colours a little bit more. To apply the dry brush, I'm just using a makeup brush. You can get proper dry brushes off Amazon, like some really nice ones and some really nice kits, but they're going to cost you about $80 to $100. I picked it up from Priceline in a set of 4 for under 20 bucks, and it does the job really well. I have to say, even without the colour on, just this dry brush looks absolutely fantastic, and I was so happy with it at this stage. So moving on to the business end, here's the colour. For SlapChop we're going to use Citadel Games Workshop contrast paint. I'm using this blue grey. You can see in the pop out there the difference between the white and the Wraithbone. The white looked a lot more bluer, where the Wraithbone looked a lot more brighter, warmer. I'm just detailing in all the little blocks and things that fall in the mud on the 3D printed models. I'm also doing the rocks. The reason I'm starting with the grey is because the contrast paints are semi-transparent. So as you move through the layers, the most recently applied layer sort of is more prominent than the layers underneath. When you're doing it over this sort of dry brush, you get fantastic details. You get nice shadows in your crevices, you get great midtones and fantastic highlights from the dry brushing. When I go to put the brown on top, it'll look like the dirt has sort of settled in around all the rocks and around the boulders, around the pillars, which is exactly the look I'm going for. Just a note on these contrast paints, they will ruin your brushes. I'm using the biggest brush I own. It's a really cheap synthetic brush, but it has a decent point on it. When I was done with this job, the point really wasn't there anymore. So don't use your sable brushes, don't use your good brushes, don't use your like A or S tier brushes you use for your model painting. Grab a crappier brush and use that to slap your contrast paints on. Moving on now to the mud, I'm using Wormwood. This is a nice dark brown. You can see over the Wraithbone on the right, it's significantly brighter. It still came up too dark though, so you'll see when I'm done, it wasn't really as translucent as the grey was and I wanted it to be. On the other hand, the snakebite leather was fantastic. Like, this stuff looks so good, it was bright. I probably couldn't have used it for the whole base, but you can see it going on here and it really makes everything just pop. Sorry for my ugly fat bald head in these shots. I am horribly nearsighted. I'm basically blind. This is why I couldn't use the top down camera. really got to get my head in there to see what the hell I'm doing, otherwise it's outside of my focal length even with my glasses on. To bring the colour back to the wormwood, I use Carrick Stone, so just dry brushing it all over the board. You can see it really lightens up the high points. Ideally the wormwood would have sort of done this for us, but it's really no effort to go back in and just apply a really light dry brush. Next up was the clump foliage. You got this stuff Amazon because it had next day delivery. All you do is you just break it up, you get your scissors and you trim up the stray fibers and super glue it down. Try and think where plants would actually grow. So they'll sort of grow between the rocks where you get a little bit of water, in the nooks and corners of the buildings. Again, we get a little bit of shade, a little bit of water pools. So I'm starting there to stick these in. I'm also sticking them over any bits I still wasn't happy with. So if anything was sort of fingery from the smoothing that I didn't quite get to cover with the sand and the grit, I'm sticking it on that as well. I really don't like this corner you can see here. It's just the wormwood is too bright, too dark. So you'll see I fix that up a bit later. I know this looks like I'm making a mess with bits of foam flock coming off this clump foliage and just falling everywhere. These little bits of foam flock that fell off, I actually picked up the bigger pieces and I glued them on the ruins themselves. They look like moss or just bushes and vegetation growing on the ruins. It really helped pick up the look. It came up really, really good in the end. I was really happy with how it looked this stage, so I had to put the board on top and it just took my breath away. It looked fantastic. Just tidying up some more loose ends with the leftover clump foliage I had. One packet would probably be enough to do 2 boards like this, so a little bit goes a really long way. We have a really beautiful river red gum resin table and I don't want to scratch, so I'm putting felt down the bottom, a little bit of contact adhesive from Bunnings and some felt from Spotlight. I think I paid $15 for a metre of this stuff. It's enough to do 4 boards. Here I am fixing up that issue I really didn't like with that dark wormwood in that corner, just throwing some foliage on top of it. Once again, trimming it up with the scissors. Sorry about the elbow in the camera, I got smart in the last 2 sides and cut from the other direction. Just trimming up the loose edges. Done and dusted. This is my first time using videography on my DSLRs. It's also my first time using Resin Lapse, SlapChop, resin modification, using Adobe Photoshop, After Effects and Premiere Pro. It's been a pretty steep learning curve, but it's been a lot of fun on the way. Huge thank you to everyone who's watched this far, and if you like this style of content, I'll be doing more DIY videos, dioramas, watch builds, showcases of figures, watches, and get the gents over some whiskey tastings and whiskey reviews. For anyone playing along at home, I'm going to pop up a bill of sale. This is what it costs to put something like this together. It took me about 280 hours over 7 months. It's been one hell of an endeavour. To my wonderful wife, you are my entire world. The kids and me love you to death. We hope you have an absolutely amazing birthday, and just thank you for everything you do for all of us. Bye everyone.